All right. Yes, we're recording. It's my pleasure to talk for at least a few episodes here about one of my favorite books, All the Pretty Horses, by one of my favorite authors, Cormac MacCarthy. And we are into the first 50 pages, I think, by now. So I think you have a pretty good sense of what you're getting into. And let me talk further about some of the things that we may have touched on before. I know we talked about some similarities between Huck Finn, Tom Sawyer, even, and in general, the protagonist of any Bildungsroman type of story. This is a tradition or a genre that McCarthy's all too aware of. And here's that quote that I may have mentioned in class. I put it up here for you guys. The ugly fact is, books are made out of books. The novel depends for its life on the novels that have been written. I think this is an important quote to keep in mind when we look at the ways that All the Pretty Horses innovates or parts company with the traditional Bildungsroman novel forms that we've encountered before. And certainly this type of innovating and this stylistic revolutionary role that McCarthy plays, it's something that you can see that's happening in Bronte as well when we were reading Jane Eyre. It's something that Mark Twain was very successful at. So McCarthy's going to be in the same vein in terms of trying to expand the art form, trying even to expand the English language itself. But he also admits, though, that in essence, a lot of what he's doing is plagiarism. In order for him to be able to do what he's doing, he has to understand and know about all the things that have been written beforehand. So let's talk a little bit about his protagonists, not just in All the Pretty Horses, but in his other works too. They're often fairly likable, good-natured, and there's an adventurous spirit that they have. When we see that from the get-go with John Grady, and it's not too far into the book where he decides to make his definitive journey heading south into Mexico. Lots of uncertainty there, lots of danger. And so he is putting himself to this test, and are going to see him be tested. Another way of describing these tests are the initiation process, and that he is being initiated into adulthood. He is being initiated into this greater awareness of the complexity of the world that he inhabits. He is learning how to suffer. He is learning what counts the most for him, and he is following his path with heart. And it's not an easy journey, but he has a particular aggressive and independent and even a lucky streak that will get him through this tale and help him survive some near-death experiences. And in the process, we see a different John Grady at the end than we do at the beginning. And we will also see some of the same John Grady at the end that we see at the beginning. And I think you could apply that rubric perhaps to Old Huck Finn. And it's interesting to play that game of how much does the character really change, and how much do they retain, and what has that character really learned throughout their experience in the novel. I want to talk a little bit about this tradition of ranching and what they call the cowboy culture. And I've juxtaposed the cowboys with the Comanche Indians here. And in essence, I think that they had a lot in common, especially their love the expansive plains, their love of animals, particularly the horse, and their ability to thrive in harsh situations. And this is something that John Grady values, and no doubt he saw that in his grandfather. And now that his grandfather has died at the beginning of the novel, he is the one carrying the torch for this tradition of the nomadic. And I have this in the notes if you want to follow them along. I've linked them here in the topics page, but certainly he values the nomadic, a certain amount of aggression when it comes to standing up for what's right. There's a certain amount of luck, I think, that John Grady relies upon. And there's this very Native American quality to his wanderlust, his need to see the country, his need to sleep in the wilderness on the ground, sort of surviving day by day with just your basics. That for John Grady and Rollins even too is heaven for them. And so that's the life that he chooses for himself at 16 and 17. And one last thing I want to say about this connection between Native American culture and the ranching culture is there's that wonderful passage, and I'll pull it up in a second here, where he goes on his ride in the sunset, and he says that the angle of the light allows him to see in the plain where he's riding an old road, and in fact it was an old trade route, and there is a description of a nomadic Indian culture traveling that road. And I think that's a very important passage because I think it helps create this mystique that's present in the land, almost like the land is still alive. The land contains these ghosts of the past. And John Grady is one who is quiet and sensitive enough to experience that. And here we are on page 3. We've got this passage I was talking about earlier. In the evening he saddled his horse and rode out west from the house. The wind was much abated, and it was very cold, and the sun sat blood-red and elliptic under the wreaths of blood-red cloud before him. He rode where he would always choose to ride, out where the western fork of the old Comanche road, coming down out of the Kiowa country to the north, passed through the westernmost section of the ranch, and you could see the faint trace of it bearing south over the low prairie that lay between the north and middle forks of the Concho River. At the hour he'd always choose, when the shadows were long and the ancient road was shaped before him in the rose and canted light, like a dream of the past, where the painted ponies and the riders of that lost nation came down out of the north with their faces chalked and their long hair plaited, and each armed for war which was their life, and the women and children, and women with children at their breasts of them, pledged in blood and redeemable in blood only. Some heady stuff here. And this is not only Cormac MacCarthy musing about the lost ancient ways of the Native Americans, but him linking his protagonist to this same sentiment, this notion of living a hard, warlike life, but that there being an honor in this way of traveling. And even when it comes to giving your life to something that's redeemable in blood only. So this idea of blood and redemption should immediately conjure also images of Jesus Christ, perhaps, and this theme of blood and in a way, it's an allusion to the novel being a whole cosmology or a whole universe in and of itself. That Cormac McCarthy is not just telling a tale isolated in history. He wants to tell the tale within its historical setting and bring into it everything that existed before and after. And that's what I mean when I'm talking about the metaphysical aspect of McCarthy's writings. And we'll talk about that here in a minute. I included this picture of it's a scene from Paradise Lost by John Milton, which was a text that McCarthy was very much familiar with. And the basic idea of Paradise Lost was, the story of God and all of the angels, including Lucifer, who was cast out of heaven, and due to discrepancies in it. I don't want to get into a detailed summary of Paradise Lost, but it basically it talks about the relationship between the divine world and the material world, and how things that happened before mankind or humankind was created by God, the things that happened, the war that took place in heaven, the creation of hell, the fall of Lucifer, all of these things shape the world that we inhabit today, and that they have been shaping the world that we live in since the dawn of time, since Adam and Eve. I think McCarthy is trying to be Miltonic in that regard. And what I mean by that is he is trying to present a full cosmic picture of a universe that exists in relation to this very small segment of historical time. So in exploring John Grady and his trials and tribulations, we're also exploring the problem of the universe itself. It's a huge undertaking for any author to undergo, but McCarthy, I think, is successful when he takes that risk. The passage I just read, you'll notice, it's very expansive, poetic, polysyndactonic. I will explain that in class. Ask me if I forget to do so. I'll explain it a little bit here. Basically, you notice how long those sentences were. You get these enchained phrases and clauses that just wrap around and around and around down the page, and they're like brushstrokes elaborating on a painting. So there's that quality to his style, which is I find it to be elegant, beautiful, masterful. And a style which I see some of you writing in at times when I'm reading your papers on the flowers. But then he also can move from that expansiveness to a very terse, unpunctuated, sort of a minimalist realism, where he's just trying to convey the action. This happened, and then this happened, and then this happened. And it's very cinematic, and it's very bare bones. He's just trying to convey the picture of what's going on. And then, so it moves very rapidly, very cinematically. And then there's times when he'll take the space to develop something like the description of that old Indian road that John Grady is headed down. Also, the colloquial language is just spot on, especially if you've ever been to Texas. I grew up in Texas. It's like I have met some of these people before, the way that they talk. It's just right on. And he weaves in Spanish into the narrative, which I think is fantastic. And it's right, because English is not the only language in America.